Good afternoon. Welcome back. Episode 20 of Afrolantican Jurisprudence, 6,000 years of extraordinary African commitment to the equal protection of law. And this episode I am particularly excited to talk about. This is about the African resistance to the Persian invasion of Egypt. Basically, what happened to the Afrocentric Eurasian Empire. And so last episode 19, we spoke about the Persians and Cambyses, the Persian king Cambyses, his conquering of Lower Egypt and putting us under the reign of what we call the last African pharaoh, Psammetichus, the Libyan, and how even in defeat, Psammetichus exemplified the precepts of Mott in that his woe and his misery was reserved for his people, and especially the people that were less, those were friends, the common citizen, versus the death of the members of his family, including his sons and his daughters. So again, that story, even in defeat, Herodotus takes Herodotus's stories paint Egyptians, Ethiopians, Africans generally as wise, as pious, as orderly, as lawful, as opposed to barbaric, as he's describing the Asians or Asiatics or Semitic peoples of that time, the Lydians, the Persians, most especially. Um, and of course, the Europeans are just emerging on the scene. That is the importance of Herodotus' history, right? That after thousands of years of Egyptian or Kemet or Kush, Nubian hegemony over that area of the world, and we prove this again through we've paid a lot of attention to taxation as well as equal protection. Taxation is the evidence we're using to demonstrate authority or illustrate that Egypt or Ethiopia or whomever had authority, and even showing that Europe at this time is breaking that authority by not paying taxes. That we talked in the story we spoke about with Croatius. And the fish and refusing to pay that over, along with silver vases and other things. So that's the dual legal story we're telling, is basically the authority and how far it extended in antiquity, these African states, but also the fact that these states also were governed by order, law, justice, in other words, the concept of Mott, which in today's world we can tease out into equal protection of law. Now we can tease it out to other things, due process of law and other things, and that's what we dealt with in our first episodes, 1 through 10, when we talked about the teachings of Ptah-hotep, when we talked about Imhotep the Vizier and the legal structures of Egypt, when we talked about the legal structures of Ethiopia or Kush, especially in its time during Meroe, when we had matriarchy, matrilineality, elections, impeachments, councils of state, hearings, and whatnot. We also even talked about social justice and criminal justice to some degree. And so, to me, this whole discussion really culminates into this one, because again, because here we have a description of not just Egypt as sophisticated, as civil, as lawful and orderly. Not only do we have a description of Ethiopia as as much as a democracy that anyone had seen at that point and for thousands of years thereafter, right, where the kings are elected, and they could also be impeached, where we have a council of state, where we have female queens that reigned as monarchs themselves all through Kemet and Kush. This one is particularly special because we have here again a very strident, brilliant, clear illustration of social justice within Ethiopia, legal justice within Ethiopia. with respect to property, with respect to liberty, criminal justice. Um, uh, it's really really fascinating. So let's get to it, right? We talked about so at this point Egypt is conquered. We're talking about the 26th, 27th, 28th dynasties, where after the 25th had to retreat back to Napata and Meroe and Kush, and started flowering and growing there. We even have a description here of Herodotus about the Ammonians and the Ethiopians and how they were constituted, and especially even their relationship between Upper Egypt and the people that left, deserted or migrated from Egypt back south, back home to Nubia, and carrying along the culture and sophistication along with it. We know that Nubia pre-existed Kemet, right, through Castul and all that, but Egypt's place as the center of trade, as the center of intercontinental trade, its proximity to the Red Sea, the Mediterranean, is what also placed itself in the midst of all types of ideas and inventions. And also, let's think about papyrus. One thing that Kemet had that Kush did not, that allowed Kemet to, let's say, surpass in with respect to a civil bureaucracy, is papyrus. Papyrus is a reed that's turned into paper, and it grows. It's basically from Lower Egypt, the Mediterranean. So having an abundance of paper, it's almost like at that time having an abundance of computer technology and what have you. So the ability to preserve and engage in record keeping is what allowed Kemet to basically surpass Kush in bureaucracy, and that's why those dynasties were so great. However, again, as it fell, and the 25th dynasty tried to hold it together, but then had to recede. The 26th and the 27th dynasty comes along, 28th, 29th, we have the Persians, the Assyrians, the Greeks, the Romans. So we have the end of the Afrocentric Empire, and so quite naturally we have people, the nobility, the learned from Egypt, from Kemet, migrating south. Some may have been captured, some may have joined the Mediterranean or Roman and those empires, but quite a few, numbers and scores, traveled southwest, perhaps east, and helped bring those ideas and greater interaction to those societies. So let's first talk. So we're in this area where Cambyses has conquered Egypt. Psammetichus has Psammetichus has surrendered. He's basically been killed, and his son at this point. And Cambyses is not finished, right? He wants to go further. So he wants to attack, again, the stories that you see popular today, 300 and Sparta and Achilles and all that, deal with Cambyses and the Persians as they attack Europe. But before they went to Europe, the Lydians and the Greeks and all of that teamed up with the Persians to bum rush the show in Africa. They were successful when it came to Egypt, particularly Lower Egypt, and they did in fact conquer Upper Egypt and install themselves as pharaohs. However, they didn't get further than that. They tried, right? They specifically sought out to attack Carthage, right? Again, basically around Tunisia, Libya today. They also set out to attack Ethiopia on two different fronts, the Ammonians and from the off the Erythraean Sea. So let's deal with some of these accounts. So first of all, they can't touch Carthage, right? So as far as their incursions into Africa, they can't get west of Egypt. They can't conquer Carthage because the Phoenicians were their navy. Right, the Persian strategy, as was common, was kind of get down or lay down. You joined us in attacking others, or you will be attacked. And so at this point in time, they had the Phoenicians at their service as far as basically their navy, which of course calls into question the Afrocentric Empire. Was a trading empire. It dealt with taxation. It was based on taxation, where Egypt taxed all these other nations and made them bring the best of their goods to Egypt. But Egypt then took those goods and then redistributed them out to all the other provinces and countries within its way. So that's how basically cedar wood and silver vases from the Middle East get to Nubia and further south. And this is how ostrich eggs and ebony wood and all that get from the African interior all the way up to Syria and Persia, etc. So there is this huge trading network that's been established. So the Persians are trying to maintain it, but at the same time they are trying to further make further incursions into Africa. So Carthage, the Ammonians, and Ethiopia, and the Phoenicians basically say that they're not going. Right? The Phoenician Navy, even though it's get down or lay down, they say they're not going to attack their children. The Phoenicians said they would not go since they were bound to the Carthaginians by solemn oaths, and since besides it would be wicked in them to make war on their own children. So that's a double thing. They had a treaty, right, a solemn oath, right? So there's a treaty between the Phoenicians, who basically run the coast of the Middle East, where we would now look to find Jordan and Lebanon and Israel, etc. And Carthage being on the African coast, they have, number one, a treaty, a solemn oath, but secondly, there are children, right? And remember, the Phoenicians, if you hadn't joined us before, who are the Phoenicians? The Phoenicians are a sailing maritime people that run the Mediterranean for a large period of time before the Greeks and the Romans emerged themselves. And their origins, as Herodotus describes, is from the south, from the Erythraean Sea that we know of to be the Indian Ocean. So these folks are coming, so their origins are somewhere either Kenya, Mogadishu, Yemen, or whatnot. So these are dark-skinned people, African people that have migrated and taken over the Mediterranean. Again, Egypt was their ships and sailing more or less focused on the Nile River. When it came to the Mediterranean and running that sea, that was typically the Phoenicians. And so the Phoenicians say that they're not going to attack Carthage, that Carthage is one of the cities that they established. So when we talk about North Africa and the racial composition of North Africa and whether Hannibal is black and Dido and whatnot, we deal with its origins. Its origins are from the Phoenicians, who are clearly an African and dark-skinned people. And these folks say that they're not going to attack their brothers, or at least their descendants, their kin folks. So that closes off Carthage to the Persians. There's in Herodotus Histories, he also talks about Indians, right? India as basically Eastern Ethiopians, right? Again, another dark-skinned people. And they won't change their laws at the request of Persia. Now, I don't know whether it's a friendly request or a forceful request, but they didn't heed it regardless. So Persia, that's as far as they've been able to expand, is to Egypt and the Middle East. They're going to go up to Rome, to Greece after this, but first they're trying to incur south, because again, it's wealthier in the south. We're making a big deal about Egypt's suzerainty and its power over the Eurasian world, over Europe and Asia at that time. But the bulk of its trade, the most lucrative items of its trade, was to the south. So again, the gold, iron, all these things, exotic animals and whatnot, those things are coming from the south. The north doesn't have a lot, but again, we'll talk about that idea of papyrus and whatnot. So the organizing principles of the north, they were able to gather strength, if not goods. Anyway, so let's talk about their Persians now attempt to conquer Nubia and Ethiopia, which you may never have heard of. Why? Because it was unsuccessful, right? If they would have conquered the rest of Africa, you probably would have heard of that, but they didn't, and so you don't hear much about our resistance. So let's talk about that. So Cambyses sends spies to Nubia, and so Herodotus describes the Nubia or the Ethiopians that he is familiar with. He says the country above Elephantine is inhabited by the Ethiopians, who possess one half of this island. The Egyptians occupy the other, right? Now again, some people, it used to be the case, not so much anymore, but it used to be the case that folks would take statements like that and try to make a division between Egypt and Ethiopia and try to make it a racial division. But we of course know that just as France and England and Germany are different nations of European peoples, Ethiopia, Libya, Egypt are just basically different African states, and they've all been described as black in one way or another, even within this very text, and then we could introduce all types of other texts. Okay, so at this point, he's familiar. Herodotus is familiar with Meroe. There's an oracle to Ammon there. And again, we know that the oracles traditionally have been women. When we talk about the Oracle of Delphi, when we talk about the Oracle of Ammon, the Oracle of Libya, these have been typically black women who have a religious authority, and not just religious authority, but a legal authority to resolve disputes of kinship or succession, right? Who is eligible for the throne, especially in a patriarchal society, because you don't know who the father really is. And then as far as the a just war, whether they are allowed to go to war or should go to war, are questions that are put to the oracles. And again, whether the people are going to follow, whether they're going to be enthusiastic about it, in large part depends on these women, on these black women that are, or at least originated as black women, that had authority. They are more or less agents of this queen mother, as caretakers of the land. Where we are saying, as far as they also settled disputes as far as national jurisdiction, even in Herodotus Histories, when it came to how far the law of Egypt extended, whether extended to other parts of Libya, was decided by the oracles. Herodotus also describes further the population of Meroe, or even further past Meroe. On leaving this city and again mounting the stream in the same space of time which it took you to reach the capital from Elephantine, you come to the deserters who bear the name Osmok. The word translated into our language means the men who stand on the left hand of the king. These deserters are Egyptians of the warrior caste who, to the number of 240,000, let me say that again, 240,000 went over to the Ethiopians in the reign of King Psammetichus. Right? So as Psammetichus loses to the Persians, 250,000 soldiers migrate south and place themselves at the service of the Kushite king. So again, when we talk about the fall of Egypt, but then the rise of Meroe and the rise of Nubia, and then furthermore about the spread of Nile Valley culture to the Niger River, to Ghana, to civilizations even farther south. This is a very, very, very important passage, that over 250,000 soldiers migrated to the south and settled within Nubia and placed themselves at the service of the king, because again, and this is also probably proof that they did not see themselves as racially distinct. They arrived in Ethiopia, they placed themselves at the disposal of the king, and in return he made them a present of attractive land which belonged to certain Ethiopians with whom he was at feud, bidding them expel the inhabitants, and they took possession of their territory. Now, Herodotus knows this much, but it's interesting that he still doesn't know where the source of the Nile is. And you'll note that 2,000 years later, when you have Arabs, travelers talking about Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, once again, the source of the Niger River is beyond them. The source of the gold fields are beyond them. They've never been able to conquer the places where the gold actually comes from. What they are able to do is often conquer the middleman or the territory where it's distributed, and by doing that, by controlling its transfer, by bottling up the resources within Africa, and being the only gatekeeper out. Basically, that's how Africa has been impoverished, by having to pay, getting the smallest price from these middlemen that are in service of others. And the wealth of the 3,000 and 4,000 years prior are because Africans themselves control those gateways, right? When you control those gateways, you lay the taxes, you set the prices. But when others then control the gateways, they set the taxes, they set the prices, and it will be favorable to them, obviously. Okay, so these ambassadors that Cambyses sends to the Ethiopians, they're there to spy on the country. But here is where we first run into, or first encounter, Herodotus's description of Ethiopians as wise, as pious, as lawful, as orderly, as just. Right? First of all, they're not fooled at all by these folks coming as ambassadors. So that shows you not only wisdom, but experience as far as international and intercontinental negotiation and contact. Some people will hold that Africans, not until the European era, had cognition of other nations, of other states, of other countries, of other continents, right? That we were a tribal people. Well, that's of course there were tribes that existed all throughout Africa, but they existed in between large state apparatus that clearly had international, intercontinental commercial networks, which required lots of communication. So here we have the Ethiopian king. His very first impression is one of being wise. He receives the gifts from these ambassadors, and this is what he says. Then, taking the purple robe, he asked them what it was and how it had been made. They answered truly, telling him concerning the purple and the art of the dyer, and the art of the dyer. So it's a dyed purple robe, right? Whereat he observed that the men were deceitful in their garments also. So first of all, I know you lying, and then secondly, look at how your gear and everything is false, right? He's calling out for catfishing of over 2,000 years ago. Next, he took the neck chain and the armlets and asked about them. So the ambassadors explained their use as ornaments. Then the king laughed, and fancying they were fetters, said they had much strong ones. And third, he inquired about the myrrh. And when they told him how it was made and rubbed on their limbs, he said the same as he had said about the robe. In other words, again, being all waxy and lotioned up. He was like, look, you guys lie about your appearance, and you're lying about why you're appearing here today. But Herodotus goes on. He talks about in his talk about the visit, where these ambassadors, they're not allowed, just as anywhere else, they're not allowed an immediate audience with the king. They're not that important, and we're going to let them know that. So for days, we're going to show you around the kingdom and impress you, so you know who you're dealing with. So in impressing these ambassadors / spies, first of all, the Ethiopians were known to Herodotus and everyone as the long-lived Ethiopians. That they are considered the Ethiopians to whom this embassy was sent are said to be the tallest and handsomest men in the world. So tall, dark, handsome, healthy, right? The ambassadors then in their turn questioned the king concerning their term of life and the diet of his people, and were told that most of them lived to be 120 years old, while some even went beyond that age. They ate boiled flesh and had for their drink nothing but milk, so stewed beef and milk. right? Sounds good to them, sounds good to me. I'll take some stewed beef and milk. And with that diet, apparently, again, living to 120 as average, so they say. Um, they even came to the wine when the gifts that were brought to them, the purple robe, the myrrh, the armlets and whatnot, jewelry. What else they brought? They brought wine. So last of all, he came to the wine, and having learnt their way of making it, he drank a draught, which generally delighted him, whereupon he asked what the Persian king was wont to eat, and to what age the longest lived of the Persians had been known to attain. They told him that the king ate bread, and described the nature of wheat, adding that 80 years was the longest term of man's life among the Persians. Hereat he remarked, it did not surprise him if they fed on dirt that they died so soon. Indeed, he was sure they never would have lived so long, 80 years, except for the refreshment that they had got from the drink, meaning the wine, wherein he confessed that the Persians surpassed the Ethiopians. So he's basically saying, you guys are not honest, you're deceitful, you don't even have the things of life. The only thing you surpass us in is getting drunk. So again, the way the Ethiopians are portrayed in Herodotus Histories, you can understand why, if you're a Eurocentric person, if you're a racist person, if you want to support white supremacy, you have to discredit Herodotus, right? You have to call him the father of lies like Strabo and whatnot, to deny that Africans were thought of in such grand terms. Let's talk about the wealth of the kingdom. Right, because you might think, well, if they didn't have purple robes, if they didn't have these dyes, then how could they be wealthy? Okay, well, listen to this. When the dead body has been dried, either in the Egyptian or in some other manner, okay, so mummification was not just an Egyptian thing, and there was different techniques. When the dead body had been dried, either in the Egyptian or in some other manner, they cover the hole with gypsum and adorn it with painting until it is like the living man as possible. Then they place the body in a crystal pillar, which has been hollowed out to receive it, crystal being dug up in great abundance in their country, and of a kind very easy to work. You may see the corpse through the pillar within which it lies, and it neither gives out any unpleasant odor, nor is it in any respect unseemly, yet there is no part that is not plainly visible, as if the body were bare. The next of kin keep the crystal pillar in their houses for a full year from the time of death, and give it the first fruits continually, and honor it with sacrifice. Wow. Crystal coffins. Right? So when we talk about mummification, we talk about pyramids in Egypt, you probably have not heard of crystal coffins in Ethiopia, and here we have Herodotus attesting to it. Now, did they dig up all the gypsum? Did they dig up all the crystal material and run out of it? And is why we don't have it to today? Have we found those cemeteries? I don't know. But it's hard to believe that this is just made up out of whole cloth, made out of nothing. Even if we were to find it slightly inaccurate and it's not technically crystal or whatever the case may be. The story's fascinating, however we might find it, right? So that's dealing with the wealth of the kingdom of Ethiopia and their wisdom. But there's more to come. It's not that they have wealth, but you have to be impressed with their concern for social justice as they spend it, right? Again, when we talk about taxation, taxation in Africa is not just, in Egypt, was not just about subjugation, it was also about redistribution, right? About making the economy diverse. Well, here also we're talking about Ethiopians using that trading, national trading system for social justice. And they had a place that was legendary called the Table of the Sun. Now the Table of the Sun, according to the accounts given of it, may be thus described. It is a meadow in the skirts of their city, full of the boiled flesh of all the manner of beasts, which the magistrates are careful to store with meat every night, and where whoever likes may come and eat during the day. The people of the land say that the earth itself brings forth food. So We've dealt with famine. It's an anti-poverty program, basically a place where anyone can eat for free. Um, that's astounding, right? That is astounding for to consider this commitment to equal protection or equal justice amongst class, amongst the poor, in describing the table of the sun. Not just social justice, criminal justice, right? This is interesting, right? I don't know whether to put this on criminal justice or the wealth of the country. When they quitted the fountain, the king led them to a prison, right? Now, this is interesting because it says it led them to a prison. And unfortunately, we have to find a way to reconcile that or not with John Henrik Clarke's contention that Africa did not have jails and prisons, what have you. But be that as it may, when they quitted the fountain, the king led them to a prison where the prisoners were all of them bound with fetters of gold, gold chains, right? Among these Ethiopians, copper is of all metals the most scarce and valuable. That's a hell of a statement. So first of all, imagine prisoners with golden chains, right? So number one, the fact that we have prisoners means we're not dealing with every offense with the death penalty, right? As a matter of fact, the death penalty, even in the 25th dynasties and the dynasties beforehand, had been abolished or reserved for the king. There had been a schedule of penalties for each particular offense. And again, when we talk about due process of law and the deprivation of liberty, again, Africans, Egyptians, Ethiopians are proven to be way, 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 way ahead of the game. So the fact that not everyone is just killed for an offense, the fact that you have a prison, that you have these golden fetters to hold people. Did you know that they also use Nubians as police forces in Egypt? They also use monkeys the way police forces often use dogs to go capture suspects and criminals. It's wild. But let's also note that again, the abundance of gold is why you can use them as shackles, right? And the more abundant something is, the less it's worth within your particular area. Others that don't have it see it as something entirely wonderful, valuable, because it's scarce. But to you, it's everywhere. And so we've always had to deal with that in antiquity and ancient times about selling our gold or selling our resources too cheaply. Well, in the olden times, today, about selling our resources too cheaply. That if we are in control of them, then we're able to restrict the supply and therefore get the highest prices. Diamonds are not scarce. They're made scarce by restricting the supply. Mansa Musa became the wealthiest man in the history of the world, right? When we talk 2,000 years later or 1,500 years later, we talk about the empire of Mali in West Africa, off the Niger River. Mansa Musa is acknowledged as the wealthiest man in the history of the world. And how does he do so? Because he's knowledgeable of how much gold is worth in other places, right? He's nominally a Muslim, and he has enough knowledge of the intercontinental world that what they have in abundance is scarce elsewhere. So to sell it at higher prices, to use taxation, again, I'm a tax lawyer, I got to get down with that, to use taxation to make each transaction more expensive for the buyers and then enrich the kingdom, to hold nuggets, etc. Gold being abundant, it's actually copper that's scarce and able to be used as currency and a whole placeholder for value. And not just Egypt, not just Ethiopia. If you study African history, you will see references to copper in just about every cemetery on the continent. And it begs the question, whether or not copper was a ubiquitous currency throughout Africa, throughout antiquity. Because if it is, then it really explains a lot more, again, of the unity, the political and cultural unity of sub-Saharan Africa as a continent, as far as linguistics, as far as commerce and trade and law, etc. So again, I just want to make that note about copper because I want to bring it up again in future episodes when we talk about later times in other areas of West African, Southern African, and Central African history. I'm always going to point out when we find copper in those cemeteries and tombs and in those trading systems. Note that also we just talked about social justice with the table of the sun. We just talked about criminal justice as far as these golden shackles and prisoners and whatnot. What about democracy, right? In their customs, they differ greatly from the rest of mankind, and particularly in the way they choose their kings. For they find out that the man who is the tallest of all the citizens and of strength equal to his height, and appoint him to rule over them. Okay. Now again, I don't take Herodotus as 100% dripping from the truth. So whether it's just because they're the tallest, I'm willing to concede that, as we know in elections today, taller people, more handsome people, more attractive people have a leg up. So I'm willing to accept that height of the person was a factor. I'm not willing to accept that it's just simply everyone gets measured and then the tallest person is chosen. I think what they're describing is elections. They choose their kings. They appoint those kings to rule over them. This is the Ethiopian, this is the Nubian way. So again, if we were to contrast this with Wakanda, number one, the Queen Mother certifies those who are eligible. Number two, a Council of State is going to appoint them instead of some battle or test of strength. And then number three, that Council of State has always retained the right or the authority to impeach the king, to order the king to kill himself and report the misery of the nation to the ancestors and ask for their help. So let's go even further. We just established social justice, criminal justice, democratic justice, right? The right of the people to be represented not by a despot, but by somebody chosen by representatives of the people. Well, here we even get even much deeper, and one of the bolder statements, one that should make you proud as a descendant of African peoples. Listen to the ultimate response of the king of Ethiopia to these Persian spies, or ambassadors as they are called. The ambassadors, on reaching this people, delivered the gifts to the king of the country and spoke as follows: Cambyses, king of the Persians, anxious to become the ally and sworn friend, has sent us to hold converse with thee, and to bear thee the gifts thou seest, which are things wherein he himself delights the most. Hereupon the Ethiopian, who knew they came as spies, made answer. And this is cold. This is shaft cold. This is, you know, this is hot stuff. Here, the king of the Persians sent you not with these gifts, because he much desired to become my sworn friend. Nor is the account which ye give of yourselves true, for ye are come to search out my kingdom. Also, your king is not a just man, for were he so, he had not coveted a land which is not his own, nor brought slavery on a people who never did him any wrong. Okay? Let me say that again. Your king is not a just man, for were he so, he would not have coveted a land which is not his own, meaning Egypt and the others in the Middle East. He would not have coveted a land which was not his own, nor brought slavery on a people who never did him any wrong. So this is about might, this is about strength, this is about international justice, but even more astounding, when right now, if you go on Twitter, there are internet trolls and white supremacists trying to convince you that Africans are somehow morally bankrupt, that we just decided one day to up and sell each other into slavery willingly, and that somehow we forced the sale of slaves onto Christians and whatnot, when it was the demand that drove slavery, and also the requirement that only slaves would be in exchange for guns, and if you don't get the guns, you're going to put yourself in a disadvantage. Now, we're not talking about that. We're not going to sit there and try to excuse or whatnot, but what we are going to say is abolitionism starts in Africa. Okay, so through this statement, brought slavery on a people who never did him any wrong, is a statement that suggests that slavery, yes, is wrong. It's the first one of basically any kind anywhere else in the world, where a monarch states that slavery should be reserved only for people that have done wrong. Check the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution. It abolishes slavery except for the duly convicted. Right? That's why, again, there's such a rush to make blacks felonies and to arrest us today. Because, again, you can require people to work without pay if they are duly convicted. Slavery is an evil unless it's used to correct or prevent or address a previous evil. And so this first statement of abolitionism, of equal protection when it comes to slavery, is uttered by an Ethiopian king. It's carried forward for thousands of years, and in 1500 and 1600, 2,000 years after this statement is made, we're going to return to Ethiopia to the statements of Zara, the philosopher Zara Jacob, who writes philosophical texts that state all men were created equal before Locke, before the writers of the European Enlightenment and what have you. So the very first abolitionist statement we find from an African king, and 2,000 years later from the same area, we have the statement, the very first iteration of all men are created equal as a disparagement of the institution of slavery specifically. We find that in Africa. So when we're dealing with these trolls and the myth of black inferiority about Africans selling each other into slavery, understand that every part of the world dealt with slavery, as lamentable as it is, including Africa. However, when it comes to chattel slavery and the holding of people, children, and keeping them as a subordinate population, note that that was not only perfected by Europeans, they're also late to the game when it comes to the statement that all men are created equal. And also when they said it, we're also dealing with, as the philosopher Charles Mill would say, a Herrenvolk enlightenment or Herrenvolk democracy, where that those rights are only for the ruling ethnic class, right? So our Ethiopian king, he's not finished dismissing his Persian guests. He has another message for Cambyses, the king of Persia, and it is one of strength. It is one that says, well, listen to this. Bear him this bow. So the gift he's returning is a bow. And remember, this is what? Absolutely consistent with the Egyptians referring to Ethiopians as Ta-Seti, land of the bow. And that was thousands of years prior. They knew of Ethiopians as Ta-Seti 3,000 BC. Herodotus refers to them giving a bow as a gift in 500-600 BC, as Europe is just coming on the scene. So again, it's hard to discredit Herodotus when his description of Ethiopians is consistent with other things we know about them. So here we go. Bear him this bow and say, the king of the Ethiopians thus advises the king of the Persians, when the Persians can pull a bow of this strength thus easily, right? So you gotta imagine I'm flexing his chest, right? When the Persians can pull a bow of this strength thus easily, then let him come with an army of superior strength against the long-lived Ethiopians. Till then, let him thank the gods that they have not put it into the hearts of the sons of the Ethiopians to covet countries which do not belong to us. Okay? Right? So, note that that statement is suggesting that they could if they would, right? That they have the might, they have the strength to conquer other places. But again, that it is a principle of justice to leave people unto themselves, to have treaties with folks, and have respect for international borders. So, again, the idea that but to the extent you have an army of superior strength, come see us. Right? Land of the bow. Ethiopians were mercenaries, known mercenaries, the world around. So, as far as being the land of the bow, being these famous archers, prior to, again, the Persians and the Greeks and the northern folks coming down with horses and cavalry and chariots, you can imagine prior to that time, for thousands of years prior, Ethiopian, Nubian archery, right? Because again, remember, Africa has the forest and the iron ore and the bronze ore to create metal weapons. And so to be able to create these metal weapons in abundance, and then also the strength to stretch them to be tall and strong and all of the stuff is what made Ethiopia and Egypt, Kemet and Kush and Aksum and all that so powerful, especially at a time. And then what happens? We don't see them lose out on this until when? The gun, right? When the gun, the horse, the cavalry, that's when things change thousands of years later. But when we're talking about mano a mano, yeah, we're holding our own. Okay, so here's the bow. Don't try to play us. Don't come through, or you're going to get served. So that's the message he sends back to Cambyses. Cambyses doesn't listen. Cambyses sends an army to attack the Ethiopians. He sends some to the Ammonians. He sends, here we go, at Thebes, which he passed through on his way. He detached from his main body some 50,000 men and sent them against the Ammonians with orders to carry the people in captivity and burn the oracle of Ammon. Meanwhile, he himself went out on the rest with his forces against the Ethiopians. So, they're attacking, and what happens? Now, again, when you're dealing with ancient warfare, one of the biggest issues you're dealing with is supplies, right? Remember when we talked last episode about Phoenicians circumnavigating all of Africa in ships, but it taking 2 or 3 years to do so, and so at certain times they couldn't carry all that stuff with them. They actually had to debark the ship and stay on land and actually grow food and whatnot, and then re-embark on their journey to get all the way around. So these things take a long time, and they take a lot of supplies. And if you run out, you're in trouble. And guess what happens to the Persians? Their soldiers run out of food. They have to eat grass. And eventually, they're so starved, they're so whooped, they're so out of supplies, yes, they turn to eat each other. They turn to cannibalism. And it's only reports of this cannibalism that makes Cambyses retreat. Right? So he's alarmed, he retreats. And also, the interesting thing is another story about the Persian defeat in Ethiopia is that the desert came and swallowed them up whole. Right? What does that sound like? That sounds like the Red Sea swallowing up the Egyptians whole as they were chasing the Hebrews. So this idea of the river, of the sea, of the sand swallowing up whole armies was not a new one. So when he gets back, Cambyses is defeated in Carthage. He's defeated in Ethiopia. He can't go any further, and so he turns on his allies. Right, Croesus, the king of Lydia and Greece, says something smart to him, and he shoots an arrow at him, and it's on between them. So that's when you pick up the story from there, and deal with Achilles and 300, and the Persian attempt under Xerxes and Darius and all that to be the masters of, or at least squelch the growing of Greece. But as far as Africa is concerned, Cambyses still remains the pharaoh of Egypt, but his troubles, he has bought a lot for his troubles. Number one, he runs into a prophecy that says his brother Smerdis is going to kill him and usurp the crown. This is a prophecy. And so Cambyses is so scared about this prophecy, he hears that Smerdis touched the Ethiopian bow and he had Smerdis killed. Right? Now, interesting thing about that is, should he have had Smerdis killed? Because they make it seem like he went crazy and is just fearful. But in Smerdis touching the Ethiopian bow, was that symbolic of Smerdis seeking to align himself with the Ethiopians, right? So we don't know. Might have been right, but the case may be he kills Smerdis. He takes possession of Egypt. He can't rule it. He disrespects all. The Egyptians had equal protection of law extended to the many religions that were under Egypt's sway, because again, it stretched so far and wide. So while the pharaohs were the sons of Ammon, sons of Amun-Ra, you still had people represented by their home gods, right? Your god typically came from your hometown, was the protector, was the overseer of your town or your area. So as Egypt encapsulated all of these places, those gods survived. They just were on a lesser plane than Amun-Ra, than Horus, than Osiris and Isis, etc. So the Persians didn't get that, right? And they felt as though in order to control Egypt, they had to smash all of that, which caused more problems, right? They disrespected the religions, they disrespected everything. And the interesting thing is, Africa is so matriarchal that he had to, and they're trying to institute a patriarchal system. This is really big time things, right? He wants a new system where the son of the pharaoh becomes the king after, where Egypt had been matriarchal, where you had to be the son of a queen mother or one of her children, right? One of the brothers, the uncles, the nephews, or what have you. So he's actually forced to marry his sisters, right? Because again, Egypt, we don't deal without a queen, right? Just like Killmonger in Wakanda, he would not have been eligible. He's going to have to, if he doesn't find a queen of his own, he's going to have to marry his sister, or somebody's going to have to represent the woman in the royal family, right? The queen mother of the nation. Because without that, again, it's the mother, the queen mother, the woman that has is the Mother Earth that authorizes the male to act in favor of the family, and in that way symbolically collect the taxes and whatnot, institute the rule of law. So so Cambyses is disrespecting all the religions, he's disrespecting nobles and all that. He's trying to he even then turns around and is fearful of his own sisters being elevated to the role of queen mother and above him, right? And then their children may then become the new pharaoh instead of who he chooses, and so he has his own sisters killed, right? So after conquering, you gain the whole world but lose your soul. He conquers all of Egypt, but then he kills his own brother, he kills his own sisters, and only to find out that the prophecy was true, that a man named Smerdis, who not his brother Smerdis, a different Smerdis, is back in Persia while he's sauntering on enjoying the fruits of Egypt. A different Smerdis is causing insurrection back in Persia, and that's how he's then overthrown and whatnot at the end of his particular reign. As far as Africa is concerned, the power in Africa remains in Ethiopia, right, in Meroe, and lasts for over another 500–600 years through the Kandakis, the Candaces, the Amanis, the female pharaohs and queens, also with the other African kings, that pretty much ends around the 4th century AD. So after Rome now has taken over the Mediterranean, has taken over the Middle East, has created its own now European empire. Now I say European empire, but it's really kind of a southwestern Mediterranean empire, because the true Europeans that are above, they don't really mess with them. The Germans, the Anglo-Saxons, they're not down with Rome. Right? So to say that Rome represents Europe is a stretch, but we're just going to say, again, that it's out of Afrocentric hands, right? That was the end of the Afrocentric empire of the Mediterranean, of the Middle East. But within Africa, again, we have the retention of Ethiopia, but then even they fall by around 300-400 AD. Their scholars, their king Ergomenes, is what? Brought up and trained in Greece, brought up and trained in Rome, and he refuses to be impeached, right, which is the right of the state. He refuses his impeachment and kills the priest that voted to have him removed. So we can see that the Afrocentric empire is not just dead, or as far as how far it extends, but we also see patriarchy and foreign ideas and influences permeating not just Egypt, but now all the way down into Nubia, where the king adopts a Greek or Roman stance and refuses the impeachment, which is constitutional within African societies. Now, again, these African societies are spreading this issue of social justice, legal justice, democracy, anti-slavery right, all of this through the Iron Age and through the Bantu migration spreads west, right? So as Sheikh Anta Diop is fond of saying, as Nubia falls asunder, and as Egypt falls asunder, the Nok civilization, Ghana, is almost immediately on the rise, such that the splendor and greatness and grandness of African state organization is uninterrupted from 4000 BC all the way up until basically 1901, when white supremacy makes itself complete over the African continent, and not just the African continent, over the Asian and American continent. 1901 is when nothing in the world moves without white folks getting paid. But this is how we got there, right? This last series, or these last 4 episodes about Herodotus, takes all the greatness we talked about from 4000 BC, the establishment of statehood, the establishment of legal processes, of hearings, of law, regulation, and whatnot, and built into a crescendo, into a pinnacle of a description of Ethiopians, not just Egyptians, but Ethiopians, as wise, as lawful, as orderly, as concerned with social justice, criminal justice, and political justice, when we talk about being the represented, the monarchy representing the people, at least through a council. So, I hope you have enjoyed or been as impressed with, and your spirits elevated about our people, what we've accomplished, and what we can therefore do in the future if fully developed, if we take all of our children and develop them in the way which honors their intelligence, which honors their spirit, which honors their innate sense of justice, and what have you. So I appreciate you all joining me for episode 20 of Afrolantican Jurisprudence. We will continue the series. We're going to talk about further about this anti-slavery or abolitionist movements in Africa, from Queen Nzinga and the creation of free states in Africa, to again to who was Zara Yacob, who was also Wilhelm Amo, a Nigerian philosopher who also wrote that all men were created equal prior to its discussion in European philosophical circles. So, with that, I'm going to let you go. Thank you for joining us, and hold tap.